Welcome, curious minds. Today we're embarking on a deep dive into, well, a really critical shift unfolding on the global stage.
That's right.
We've pulled together some fascinating sources, everything from deeply personal reflections to some pretty incisive analyses, to explore how a rapid change in scientific output from one nation is fundamentally reshaping our understanding of a complex human experience: autism.
Hmm.
Our mission today is really to navigate the intricate cultural nuances, confront the ethical questions, and grasp the profound global implications of this evolving scientific landscape. We want you to understand what happens when the world's new scientific powerhouse begins to define autism, and crucially, how those definitions might, ripple across borders and influence us all.
And it's truly compelling, I think, to consider not just the sheer volume of new information emerging, but how deeply ingrained cultural assumptions can subtly yet profoundly influence something as seemingly objective as scientific research
Right.
and the frameworks we use for diagnosis. As we explore this, we'll connect the dots between, well, ancient cultural values and very modern scientific methods, observing how history and culture converge in this really contemporary way.
Okay, so to really grasp the layers here, let's start with a deeply personal journey shared in our sources. A journey marked by both profound admiration and this persistent sense of ambivalence.
That tension.
Exactly. This individual speaks of a lifelong fascination with China, spanning from the intricate, almost language-made physical in Jackie Chan's kung fu choreography,
Oh yeah, Kung Fu theater.
which captivated them, every Saturday afternoon on Kung Fu Theater, right up to the audacious technological innovation you see in something like the BYD Seal oh 07 DMI.
Fat car, wow.
I know, a hybrid car boasting a near-mythic 2,000-kilometer range. Imagine driving that far on a single tank and a charge. It's clear this is a nation just pushing past limits, promising a different kind of future.
Indeed, the capacity for invention and the sheer drive to innovate that China demonstrates is truly remarkable, quite inspiring, actually. However, our sources immediately introduce what's described as a crucial nod of hesitation that accompanies this admiration. And this is where we encounter how autism is often framed in China,
Yeah.
not as, a different way of being, a neurotype with its own strengths and challenges, but rather as a disruption to harmony, even a disorder to be hidden or institutionalized. This framing, it just creates an immediate tension between that awe inspired by innovation and a deep concern for the human experience within that system.
And that tension is where the personal resonance becomes incredibly strong. The thought of traveling to a place so admired, yet knowing that as an autistic person, your very presence might sit uneasily within that cultural frame.
Right.
Or worse, lead to being sequestered out of sight. Our sources recount this really raw personal experience of an autistic shutdown in Germany. And in that moment, the highly efficient and orderly system there, it just seemed to have no category for what was happening.
No box to tick.
Exactly. This led to a feeling of being broken and ultimately to being sent home, as if that was the only conceivable solution. This experience powerfully illustrates the terror of being a Gestalt language processor, someone who processes language in chunks, often relying on familiar scripts.
Yes.
Suddenly stripped of those vital tools in a system entirely unprepared to understand or accommodate their experience. It just highlights that profound fear of voicelessness in a world that demands, verbal articulation as proof of your humanity.
And that specific anecdote, it really brings home the fear that can shadow the desire to explore new places when you live with an autistic experience.
Right.
It forces us to ask, how do you navigate a shutdown when you can't explain yourself?
Right.
When the words fail and those familiar communication scripts are just gone? In a system that sees autism primarily as a disruption to be managed, the potential for erasure or containment becomes a very real, deeply personal concern. It underscores that while the specific places and cultures might change, the fundamental challenge of understanding and genuinely accommodating neurodiversity remains a universal one.
So let's dive deeper then into these cultural differences.
Yeah.
How does the Chinese diagnostic system, the CCMD, that's the Chinese classification of mental disorders, how does that typically compare to Western frameworks like the DSM or the ICD when it comes to, understanding and diagnosing autism?
Well, the CCMD-3, as our sources explain, it offers a really striking contrast to its Western counterparts. Instead of primarily focusing on individual deficits or impairments, like the DSM often does,
Okay.
it frames autism through the language of interpersonal harm and qualitative damage. The emphasis here is less on an individual's internal experience and more on what their difference, quote, does to the web of family and society around them.
Ah, the impact outwards.
Exactly. And this perspective is deeply aligned with Chinese cultural values that have roots stretching back centuries. Values like social cohesion, harmony with nature, the family as the central unit, flexible adaptation as a key virtue.
Right.
Autism, for instance, is often described as a kind of yin disorder, where social isolation or withdrawal are seen as imbalances in the body's energies. A study designed within this framework might say prioritize researching family integration or community support,
Okay.
seeing individual adaptation as part of a larger social whole, which is a subtle but profound shift from Western approaches, often focused on individual skill acquisition.
That's a significant difference in perspective. So if the diagnosis itself is framed through this distinct cultural lens, how do the typical approaches to treatment then diverge in China compared to what we commonly see in the West? What interventions get prioritized?
Yeah, that's a crucial question. The CCMD prioritizes continuity with traditional Chinese medicine, or TCM, and a broader cultural narrative of stability. It often views the DSM's frequent updates and shifting categories with maybe a bit of suspicion,
Interesting.
seeing them as perhaps too changeable or culturally specific.
Yeah.
So you'll find treatments leaning heavily towards TCM practices like acupuncture, herbal remedies, qigong, all aimed at restoring balance within the individual and their social environment.
Right, restoring harmony.
Precisely.
Right.
But what's particularly insightful here, I think, is that despite these profound differences in language, cultural lineage, therapeutic approach, a common thread often emerges. Both systems, whether through applied behavior analysis, ABA in the West, or TCM in China, still largely treat autism as a deficit to be corrected,
Yeah.
an interruption that must be managed.
So similar outcomes despite different reasoning.
Often, yes. This can lead to similar consequences, such as institutionalization in China, where children might be removed so that the social fabric may remain undisturbed.
Right.
Now, while that's framed as protection, it often comes at the cost of the child's visibility and agency,
Right.
mirroring, in many ways, Western approaches that aim to sort of normalize autistic behavior.
It's striking then, isn't it, that despite such vastly different cultural roots, both systems can ultimately arrive at this shared experience of management, of containment for autistic individuals. Knowing that makes the next part of our deep dive even more critical. How this narrative is now being amplified, maybe even redefined globally through this dramatic shift in scientific output.
Yeah.
Our sources highlight a significant change since 2010. What exactly does this shift look like in terms of China's contribution to global autism research?
The trajectory is, it's startling. Simply startling. In 2010, China ranked 13th in global autism research with a modest 31 publications.
31, okay.
By 2023, that number had exploded to 173 autism-specific papers, rocketing them to second place globally.
Wow, from 13th to 2nd in a little over a decade.
Exactly. And this rapid increase mirrors China's broader ascent. They became the largest overall producer of scientific publications globally around 2018. What's important here is that they aren't just publishing domestically.
Right, these are going into big journals.
Big, influential global outlets, like Nature portfolio titles, setting the tone for what counts as legitimate knowledge on an international scale.
That's an astonishing rise in influence. And our sources mention some key researchers shaping this new landscape. Can you tell us a bit more about them?
Certainly. We see figures like Tao Guotai, who was instrumental in introducing autism diagnosis to mainland China back in 1982.
Okay.
Then there's Sophia Shang-sun, whose work has been really vital in challenging assumptions about prevalence. She demonstrated autism rates comparable to the West, which helps, globalize our understanding. And Suing is pioneering biomarker-based detection methods, particularly studying the gut microbiome, which is a real cutting-edge area of research. These researchers are truly at the forefront, actively shaping the global record of autism.
Wow.
However, as you alluded to, the sheer volume of publications, while impressive, tells only one part of the story, the methodology sections. Well, they often reveal another, more complex narrative.
And this is the critical dissonance we need to hold on to, right? Our sources cite a recent study published in Nature from Wuhan, research on the improvement of daily living skills of children with autism in virtual campus environments.
Sounds good on the surface.
It does. It sounds like forward-thinking progress, maybe even cutting-edge tech. But then you look at the methodology and the truth reveals itself. 30 children recruited from a special education institution, 6 selected as participants.
6.
Just 6 autistic children studied in a segregated institutional setting. What does a methodology like this imply for the integrity of the research and, maybe more importantly, for the lives of the children behind the data?
This is where we really have to pause and ask some hard questions. What kind of insights are we genuinely celebrating when they are, quote, grounded in the lives of children who are institutionalized, separated from family, already framed as disruptions to social harmony?
Yeah, the ethics.
The ethical concerns are serious. Can an institutionalized child, recruited by authority, studied under supervision, ever truly exercise genuine choice in participating? And beyond ethics, a sample of only 6 children from a segregated environment severely limits the generalizability, right?
Of course.
How applicable are those findings to the broader autistic population? It means the scientific insights, even though published in prestigious journals, might have very limited real-world applicability. This is the profound paradox of China's research boom. Rapid advancement in publication volume, yet these often problematic underpinnings in practice that, frankly, reduce children to data points, stripping their agency, including their lived experiences.
And this isn't just an issue contained within China's borders, is it? Why does this particular approach, this volume of research, matter for autistic people everywhere, for families, educators around the world? What are the wider ripple effects here?
Oh, it matters profoundly. Because in science, authority is largely, maybe unfortunately, a question of volume and influence.
Right. The numbers game.
Exactly. Those
Yeah.
raw counts of papers and citations,
Yeah.
what we call bibliometrics, they're incredibly powerful. They drive what gets included in meta-analyses, systematic reviews, and ultimately what professional associations use to draft practice guidelines worldwide. Policy, in essence, follows the footnotes. So if a substantial and growing body of global research frames autism primarily as a disruption, focuses on segregated institutions, emphasizes remediation of daily living skills, well, those assumptions will inevitably seep into global standards.
It just becomes the accepted view.
Knowledge migrates, and what begins as a case study on institutionalized children in Wuhan may end, as our sources put it, in an IEP, an individualized education program in Los Angeles.
Wow.
Or it could fuel movements like profound autism, gaining ground in the U.S. and Australia movements that advocate for more restrictive, deficit-based understandings, potentially influencing funding and services for all autistic individuals.
And that's precisely where the risk of erasure comes in, isn't it? In the West, autistic advocacy movements have fought incredibly hard for decades to reframe autism as identity, as community, as simply a different way of being.
Building those counter-cannons.
Exactly, building countercannons of knowledge and experience to challenge these deeply entrenched deficit models, pushing for inclusion and recognition. But a flood of deficit-based, remediation-oriented research, published at scale in global journals, it threatens to drown out those voices
It really does.
and potentially undo decades of hard-won advocacy. It truly becomes a struggle for who gets to define the narrative of autism globally.
Precisely. And look, this isn't about xenophobia or disparaging any single culture. It's fundamentally about epistemic power, who gets to define autism. What is considered pathology? What counts as skill? What is truly valued? Our sources highlight a crucial historical moment. Tao Guotai's initial diagnosis in China in 1982 was heavily influenced by Kanner's work,
Kenner, yes.
which, as we know, carried eugenic undertones
Yeah.
and a distinct pathologizing frame. This was chosen over Sukareva's earlier, much more humanizing approach, which remained largely ignored then.
A critical choice.
A critical choice that cemented a deficit-based legacy from the very beginning. The 4 initial cases Kyle presented, a girl hidden away, a boy with repetitive movements, they became the foundation for understanding autism as a disease of loneliness, rather than, say, understanding unrecognized autistic language or presence or just a different way of being needing specific support. And that early framing, it continues to influence the direction of research today.
So we find ourselves circling back to that initial paradox, don't we? That deep longing to engage with a culture of incredible innovation and rich history, but shadowed by the stark reality for autistic individuals within that system. It's this profound tension between admiration for human ingenuity and a deep-seated fear of erasure, a fear of how your very existence might be categorized, treated, and ultimately understood by the scientific community.
And a key insight here, I think, is that this isn't a contradiction unique to China. Let's be clear. The West, too, chose Kanner's pathologizing lens over Sukareva's more careful humanizing accounts.
That's true.
largely because Kanner's framing aligned with existing systems that sought to, well, contain and correct difference, and resonated with eugenic ideas prevalent at the time. Sukareva's work, offering a less pathologizing view, remained untranslated, largely unknown for decades.
So history repeats, in a way.
In a way, yes. And now, as China ascends as this scientific powerhouse, we are witnessing a very similar dynamic unfold on a global scale, where the sheer volume of research, rather than necessarily its ethical grounding or its alignment with neurodiversity-affirming principles, is rapidly gaining authority.
This deep dive truly reminds us that volume becomes authority. The more papers grounded in deficit logic, often focusing on these institutionalized settings, flow into global journals, the more those assumptions just get naturalized, cited, enshrined in practice worldwide. What begins as a case study on a handful of children in Wuhan may very well end as a recommendation in an American classroom, influencing policies, perspectives across continents. For autistic people everywhere, the stakes couldn't be higher.
Absolutely.
We must resist being reduced to data points in these deficit-driven models and actively keep alive the countercanons of autistic knowledge, the ones that value identity, community, diverse ways of being. Our stories, our unique ways of communicating, our frameworks of care. They mustn't be lost beneath this overwhelming weight of bibliometrics.
Which really raises an important question for you, the listener, to consider. How do we as a global community ensure that our pursuit of scientific knowledge about neurodevelopmental conditions is always profoundly grounded in care, recognition, and genuine inclusion, rather than simply pathology and containment?
Yeah. What stories are we truly amplifying in the scientific record? And whose voices are we allowing to ultimately define what it means to be human?